do chapter 8, the end of chapter 8 of Maimonides' Laws of the Kings, which just introduced the concept of a Noahide. It was very interesting to me, the differentiation we learned last week of those Gentiles that are living in Israel because they want to live in Israel and therefore are accepting the laws of Noah because that's what you need to do to live in Israel, as versus the Noachides that are outside of Israel or in any other situation where there's no coercion on them. It's just purely from their own desire to be closer to God. And we said such Noachides are called Chasidei Umos Ha'olam, which means from the righteous of the nations of the world, that they're righteous because they're truly turning to God with a desire to come close. They just want to be close to God. And they're doing this purely from their heart, from a desire to really have God in their life. So that was like the last point we were discussing in chapter 8. In chapter 9, we sort of did a little historical overview, explaining how Adam, the first man, was giving six commandments, 6 broad commandments. When we say a commandment, of course, we know there are many, many laws within each commandment. From God, not to serve idols, not to curse, not to murder, not to anything immoral, not to steal, and to set up courts of justice. And then when after Noah and the flood, because Noah and his sons took care of the animals for a year, and that's how the animals survived the flood, so God, in compensation for this, gave man the ability to eat from the flesh of animals. And then man was given the additional 7th commandment, not to eat the flesh of an animal if it was cut when the animal was still alive. So those are the 7 broad commandments. And this passed on from generation to generation to generation until we said we came to Abraham. So Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, Abraham, Isaac, and Yaakov, our forefathers, were given commandments by God, but really, in a sense, the only commandments they really were given were these 7 commandments, meaning Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and their sons, the 12 tribes, were all Noachides. And as Noachides, they were obligated to keep these 7 broad categories of law the same way all of you are obligated to keep them. Truly, they kept many more laws, because starting from Abraham, he already knew the laws of the Torah, which of course he wasn't given and wasn't commanded to him, but he kept them anyway in a, let's call it in a voluntary fashion. So, for example, we know based on, as it's recorded biblically, Abraham kept Passover. Of course, the Jews hadn't even gotten to Egypt yet, let alone been redeemed. But the commandments of Passover are biblical. But was he commanded to keep Passover? No. Nothing was commanded besides the 7 laws of Noah. So that's what he kept. And additionally, we said, which was really living with the times last week, because that was the Torah portion of last week, additionally, he was commanded uniquely to circumcise himself. So circumcision was the only commandment he received from God besides the 7 Noahide laws. Again, he kept everything, but he wasn't commanded to keep it. All he was commanded to keep were the 7 Noahide laws and circumcision. So this passed on to his children, to Isaac and to Jacob and to the 12 tribes, that they kept everything on a voluntary basis, but what they were commanded to keep was the laws of Noah, because they were all Noahides, plus the commandment of circumcision, because that's what God had commanded Abraham. And then additionally, there were other things that started with each one of them. Abraham was the first one to pray on a regular basis to God, so he began the concept of the morning prayers, which then continued to all of his descendants, including Isaac, Jacob, and the tribes. We see biblically that Isaac separated a tithe, so we get the concept of taking away a tithe from Isaac, and he started the afternoon prayers. So from him, we also have the afternoon prayers. Jacob, because of, if you remember biblically what happened with Jacob when the angel struck him on his thigh, from there we have the concept of not eating a certain part of the flesh of an animal, and he prayed the evening prayer. So from him started the concept of the evening prayer. So by the time we come to the 12 tribes, they know they have to pray in the morning. That they got from Abraham. They have to pray in the afternoon. They got that from Isaac. They have to pray in the evening. They got that from Jacob. They have to tithe. They can't eat this part of the animals like thigh bone. They have to circumcise. They have to keep all the laws of Noah. And they're doing everything else on a voluntary basis until, of course, we come to Moses and to the giving of the Torah. And then gradually they were obligated and responsible for everything. So at this point, Maimonides now goes into lots and lots of the laws, of these 7 laws of Noah, in terms of what happens if someone transgresses. And we said basically, I'm not going to read and translate and go through all the laws because I'm only going to pull out what I think is relevant for our discussion, because not all of these things are relevant to us on a practical basis. But the overarching concept is relevant, and we've said it before. If a Noahide is transgressing the laws, the punishment is the death sentence. And the reason for that, which I think is very powerful for us to understand, as I think did mention last week, is because we're in this world to serve God. And it says God's saying, if you're not serving me, why are you in my world? What are you doing in my world? How are you living your life? What are you doing of value if you're not serving God? Now, in the prayers in the morning, there's a certain prayer towards the end of the prayers, which says that one of the things we pray there is that we shouldn't live for nothingness. And sometimes when I'm focused, I'm not pretending I'm always focused, but when I'm focused, I really stop on those words and think that's such a powerful thought, and I don't want to live for nothingness. God gave me another day of life. What do I do with it? What am I going to do with it? That's why, in a sense, we say the prayer we say in the morning, the Moda Ani prayer when we wake up. It's a very short 8-word prayer. But what we're basically saying in that prayer is, thank you, God, for giving me another chance. Thank you, God, for giving me a gift called life. Thank you, God, for trusting me one more time. I don't know, I don't know, but today you trusted me one more time. Thank you. I hope I live up to your trust. When we want to make our lives meaningful, it's interesting. I guess I don't have to dedicate this in his memory, but there was a very great Jewish rabbi that just suddenly passed away, I guess over Sabbath. His name was, he was knighted. He was Lord Jonathan Sacks. He was the chief rabbi of England. I'm just thinking of something that happened with him, a little vignette with him and the Rebbe. To bring out this point, I'll share 2 stories with him and the Rebbe that I think both are relevant in sort of thinking of what I just said. So Jonathan Sacks, he was a student at Cambridge University in Oxford, and so he's British. And one summer he gathered up his pennies. He wanted to travel to America and interview all these great Jewish leaders. And he was a penniless university student traveling by buses, going around the country. And when he came to the Rebbe, where I think at that point he was in California, when he was told he had an audience, he traveled by bus from California to get to New York and to meet this world Jewish leader, the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And he started off, asking the Rebbe questions. That's what he was doing. He was interviewing all of these Jewish leaders. And then at a certain point, he says, the Rebbe turned the table on him and started asking him questions and started interviewing him. He's a kid at university. How many Jewish students are there in Oxford, in Cambridge, and what is happening in Jewish life in Cambridge, and what are you doing for Jewish life in Cambridge? And he's like, the situation I find myself in, talking very politely in the English style. And the Rebbe said, we don't find ourselves in situations, we create situations. And basically the Rebbe gave him this mandate to go back to university and make a difference. And he said that was so life-changing for him, because he was used to going to Jewish leaders and they were talking about themselves or about, various important great things. But suddenly the Rebbe was looking at him as a great Jewish leader and giving him the responsibility to go somewhere and make a difference. And that was, of course, the Rebbe's perspective at every single human being. At every single human being, the Rebbe looked at as a leader. You're the leader of your family, you're the leader of your community, you're the leader on your block, you're the leader in your workplace. Every one of us is God's emissary. Every one of us is here to make a difference in the world. And that's sort of, again, going back to this concept of the Noahide, that if he's not serving God, what are you in this world for? You're in this world to make a difference. You're in this world to be a leader. You're in this world to change things. And similarly, again, there's many stories with him and the Rebbe. I'm just saying this other little vignette should be an elevation for his soul. So when he finished his university career, he had like 3 career choices ahead of him. I don't remember what they were. I think one was to become a professor in a university, and one was to become a lawyer, and I don't remember. Maybe one was to be a doctor. I don't remember. Whatever it was. And he consulted with the Lubavitcher Rebbe. He was very, very impressed with him based on his original acquaintanceship, and I guess he had kept up a connection. I really don't remember. But he asked the Rebbe what he should do. Should he become a professor? Should he become a doctor, a lawyer, whatever the options were? And the Rebbe said, no, I think you should become a rabbi. I think you should become a rabbi. It wasn't on his list. The Rebbe was giving him free, unasked for advice. You should become a rabbi, and you should teach rabbis. Actually, I think the Rebbe said you should teach rabbis, and to teach rabbis, you need to become a rabbi. And again, the same perspective of like, you want to make a real difference in this world. So do something that's meaningful. You know, I doubt it was as lucrative as his other 3 options, but he did listen to the Rebbe's advice, and he became a rabbi, and eventually he became he was appointed the chief rabbi of all of England. So it's just interesting how we sometimes think, well, would it be better for me to do this or better for me to do this? And the Rebbe is saying, no, do something that's going to make a difference in the world. Each one of us are there to do something big, do something meaningful, do something that's ultimately important. Sometimes we have transient things that are in front of our eyes as like, well, you know, and they're just saying, go out and make a difference, which I think is very in sync with this point here. Like we're saying, the Moda'ani prayer in the morning of like, thank you, God, for giving me another day. You're trusting me one more day. You're giving me an opportunity to serve you one more time. This time I won't blow it. Hope I didn't blow it in the past, and this time I'm really going to try to stay focused. So we have a lot of laws here about, first we start off with idolatry, what one does to be guilty, and then cursing, and what one does to be guilty, and then murder, and what one would do that would be guilty. And the immoral actions, all the people he's not allowed to have relationships with, and, you know, all of that. Lots and lots of laws of forbidden relationships. And about stealing. So all the laws, all the things you're not allowed to do. An interesting detail within the laws of what you're not allowed to do is, even if, we're talking here about capital punishment, we're talking here about stealing. Even if you steal less than the value of the smallest coin, you are guilty of stealing. And why do I think that's an interesting point to mention? I didn't mention anything about any of the other ones as I'm skimming. I mean, I did learn this before, and I was just skimming it to remind myself. Because so many times there's so many little dishonesties, right? Little dishonesties. I mean, everyone else in the whole world is far more dishonest than us, right? But there's so many big dishonesties there. Just these little, you know, I don't know. I think to me, like the most classical thing I could think of is like there's a pen lying around and you pick it up and write with it. You know, you're somewhere in someone's pen. And that's stealing. I mean, you put it down afterwards, you know, you leave it, you don't hook off with it. Obviously, the person didn't care less about the pen. The person probably lost their pen, whatever. I know in my school, we would do in the beginning of the years, we'd sort of make a collective acceptance upon ourselves that we all give everyone permissions to use all of our pens. So we shouldn't fall prey to that. You know, they gave you the wrong change at the store, which you only notice when all these little things. But it's very interesting to note that as Maimonides writes this, a person is culpable for stealing even if he stole less than the value of the smallest coin. And then he adds another law. Let's say someone stole this amount, or any amount, and someone else stole it from him, right? You have thief A, that whatever he stole was stolen by thief B. Who's guilty? Maimonides says both of them are. Which again shows us that sometimes you can look around and it's such a world of dishonesty. So why am I guilty? The money I'm taking was like all the excuses people make. The money I'm taking was not honestly earned by the other person in the first place. Maimonides says doesn't make a difference. Doesn't make a difference. But it's such a small value. Maimonides says it doesn't make a difference. It doesn't make a difference. It's that just in other words, there's a tremendous value to being honest. And the value of being honest overrides the practical, like you could say, the practical, hi Crystal, the practical, how much money was it worth anyway? Like, what's the bother anyway? There's stories of people that passed away and come back to, like holy people, come back to their children in their dreams like, I owed so-and-so $13. Please make sure to give it to him. Like this little person comes back from heaven to tell you. But yeah, it's disturbing them there. Or stories of people that, walked far distances to return small sums of money that was erroneously given to them, like too much change, which they only realized when they were like 3 hours away from the store. But they walked back to make sure they didn't want to take it. Obviously, that's stealing. I mean, they didn't take it. It was given to them. I don't know if from the letter of the law they had to do that. But there's a tremendous, tremendous, tremendous value in honesty. And because honesty is so difficult to maintain in our society, maybe always, but for sure in our society. So it's really worthwhile to remember this point of one is guilty from the law if it's even such a tiny sum that it's less than the value of this smallest coin. Okay. Now there's also this concept of establishing courts of justice. Of course, we know that's one of the 7 Noahide laws. The concept of these courts of justice is for Noachides to judge Noachides on the laws. And that's what this is how Maimonides' explanation of why, remember we learned this, for those that were in the classes then, we learned this at length over several weeks, this question of why was the entire city of Shechem killed out, remember, by 2 of the tribes, by Simon and Levi, after Dinah had been abducted. The prince of the city, of the town, had abducted Dinah. But why, and when Shimon and Levi, when Simon and Levi came, they killed out the entire town. So why was the whole town guilty? Obviously, they're not murderers. They weren't just in a vengeful mood. And obviously, there's a tremendous miracle of God. They were 2 13-year-old boys. Had 2 13-year-old boys kill an entire town. Obviously, they were doing what God wanted. But why would God want them to do this? What were they doing wrong? So there's various reasons given. But since we're looking at Maimonides, Maimonides mentions this here. So the answer he's giving is because they didn't set up courts of justice. Because the entire town knew, I don't know how many people were in the towns in those days, but the entire town knew that Hamor, the prince of the town, had abducted Dinah, was holding her captive, and they didn't do anything about it. And therefore, they were all guilty. They were supposed to set up court of justice. They were supposed to try him. At that point, the nations were careful with morality because they remembered what happened with the flood. It wasn't so many years before. That's the crazy thing, how they so fast sank to idolatry, but other things they still were careful with because of the flood. So that was not a common thing then. It was not a done thing then. It was something they were careful about. And yet here, Hamor violated all the laws of Noah that everyone knew, that people were careful with, and they didn't do anything. They didn't set up a court of justice. They didn't try him for kidnapping and abducting and violating Dinah. all of which he should have been killed for. And since they didn't, they deserve the death sentence. So why am I standing on this point? Because I think Maimonides is giving us a very, very powerful lesson here of the concept of our responsibility for the group. In other words, it's very interesting. Now again, there are very many sages question this issue of what did. You want to say hi to everyone? Say hi, Daniel. Hi, Sherry. Hi, yeah. Corinne's on, but you can't see her picture. Say hi, Corinne. So the sages.
Hey, hi.
Hey, Daniel, you're coming to visit me soon.
Oh, yes, God willing. Yeah.
Get there, all the way down, trucking all the way. So the sages question, why were they killed? Now, obviously, they understand there was a legitimate reason, but what was the reason? There are various answers given. But we're just going to focus on Maimonides' perspective now, because we're looking at Maimonides. I think it's a very powerful lesson. What Maimonides is saying is that to put it in a cat. Yeah, cat says meow, meow. That's right. So to decontextualize it, what Maimonides is saying is we have an obligation for the morality of that which goes around us. We have an obligation to stand up for moral values. Now, obviously, we don't have the power to make a tribunal court and judge people if they're violating Noah's laws, and I'm not suggesting that. But on our level, we have an obligation to stand up for morality. We have an obligation to stand up for justice. We have an obligation to stand up for correct behavior as per God's laws. And if we sort of let other people do whatever they're doing, live and let live, not really my business, as long as they're not bothering me, I say no. Maybe that was what the people of Shem were thinking. Well, Hamor did kidnap, did abduct, is violating, is holding as hostage Dinah, but hey, got nothing to do with me. God says, really? Of course it has to do with you. You're watching, you're observing, you're not stopping. You're not trying him. You're not releasing her. Of course it has to do with you. You are all obligated to death sentence for not standing up for it. So, in our world, it hopefully shouldn't be such situations, but I'm reminded, it's a horrible thing to even think of, but since I guess it's the similarities, it just reminded me, there was a situation a few years ago when this man had been holding these women captive for years, like in a room in his house, and he would torture them. And one night, some man not from the neighborhood was walking by, and he heard the women scream, and he broke down the door and he released them. He called the police, whatever he did. And I remember when it happened that the question was raised, they're not in a forest somewhere, they're not in a jungle, they weren't on a farm, they were on a block in a city street with houses all around. And they were held that way for I remember 10, 15, 20 years. How did nobody else hear them scream in all these years? And the assumption was people heard and did nothing about it. Not my problem. I don't know what's going on. I don't want to get involved. So there always is a sense of we need, as Maimonides is pulling out here, we need to stand up for morality. We need to stand up for God's laws. And we need to do whatever we can to make a difference. Yeah. Why don't you show that to Tati? Yeah. So that is the end. I mean, we didn't do that much of chapter 9. Now we're going to start chapter 10. Yeah, you're showing people that. Chapter 10. So,
Mama.
Yeah. So what if a Noahide didn't know the law and he violated the law unknowingly? Never learned. He didn't know. Is he obligated? Is he guilty? Is he going to be punished? Are we supposed to punish him? Or is he innocent because he didn't know? Which, of course, that's very relevant because there's you know, about 8 billion Noachides out there that don't know the laws. So how do we view this? So for a lot of the laws, he is not culpable. He's viewed as innocent. He didn't know. He's ignorant. Except for a few that we don't accept that because we say he should have known or should have figured it out. One, of course, is murder. We don't accept it as an excuse that he didn't know that God doesn't let. Or if he would, let's say, have relationships with someone else's wife, and he would say, "Oh, I didn't know you're not allowed to do that." We would say, "You should have figured that out. You should have learned. You should have understood that that's something that God wouldn't let." Now, let's say not that he didn't know, and not that it was an accident, but he was forced. Let's say he was in a situation that he was coerced to violate a law. Is he guilty then or not? And the answer is no, he's not guilty then, which is interesting because for a Jew, there are situations for idolatry, adultery, and murder where if someone is forcing us to do idolatry, adultery, or murder, then we are not allowed to do them, even though we're forced. And if we have to die, we have to die. But we cannot, because of coercion, serve an idol, or murder someone, or commit an adulterous act. But a Noahide is allowed to violate those if he is being coerced. Here, we're not talking about ignorance. You should have knowledge. We're not talking he didn't realize. We're saying he's coerced. And in such coercive situations, he's not demanded to, as we would say, go beyond just for sanctification of God's name and die. He doesn't have to. Of course, he could choose to, but he doesn't have to. I know it's going to class afterwards, maybe. No. You can go ask someone downstairs. No, we can't do it. Danielle says, I remember that. I know that's your favorite snack. It's an interesting concept, this idea of voluntarily risking your life for God when you don't have to. I don't know if you remember, I remember discussing with you this concept of this Jew who was in Soviet prison camps for 20 years, and for 20 years he refused to violate the Sabbath, which means every single week for 20 years. Oh, just 1 second. My son wants something. I better just take care of it. Every single week for 20 years, he risked his life because, of course, you can't say in Soviet prison camps where you're being punished for serving God and teaching others to serve God that you're serving God, so it's your Sabbath and you're not working. And yet, every week for 20 years, he risked his life. Did he have to? No, he did not have to. You have to for idolatry, adultery, and murder. You don't have to for keeping the Sabbath. But he chose to. So I'm just bringing this out that one does not have to risk their life or lose their life for keeping the Noahide laws. But of course, there's always the concept of choosing to say, as this person chose to say, like, life's not worth living if I'm not living it for God. Well, what am I saving my life for? What? You know, if I'm not worth it. Yeah, I know I don't have to, but I'm not going to live that type of life. Now, okay, now, what if a Noahide wanted to convert and become a Jew? Well, of course, he's allowed to. And then he has to go through the whole process of becoming a Jew, which he's allowed to. Of course, sometimes there's a, there's a certain sense of a Jew sort of saying, like, we sort of discourage people from converting. We're very unusually, because I think probably every other, faith might desire converts. And Judaism discourages conversion with the feeling of everyone can serve God as they are. There's no need to convert. However you are, you could serve God, and you're serving God, and you're connecting to God. And it's a big responsibility to be a Jew, and there's lots and lots and lots and lots of laws. Why should you do it? Serve God as you are, and God's very happy, and that's what God wants from you. But let's say a Noahide said, no, I know you're supposed to push me away, and I know you pushed me away 3 times. I know the whole show, and I'm still coming back. All right, fine, no problem. He learns, he studies, he circumcises himself, he immerses in the mikvah, he does all this through a tribunal court, and he's Jewish. And let's say a month later he says, I think this was a mistake. What am I doing this for? You were right. It was simpler having 7 than having 613. I was serving God very well then. Now it's much more difficult. I think I want to go back. I think I want to become like a ger toshav. Maimonides say, no such thing. You can never go back. Meaning, again, we discourage conversion, but anyone that wants in the world, obviously there's nothing of race, color, or creed, anybody that wants, if they push hard enough, they accept it. But once they do go through the process and become a Jew, they are a Jew. And it'd be just like any Jew saying, God, I'm not interested in serving you anymore. God would say, so what? You think I'm giving you up? Now, what if somebody was adopted? So let's say a child, let's say there's a couple, maybe they can't have children, or for whatever reason, they took into their home a non-Jewish child as their own. So when a couple does that, when a Jewish couple adopts a non-Jewish child, or maybe putting it in an even more plausible situation, let's say, let's start with this one, that'll make it a little more complicated. Let's say a Jewish couple is adopting, they want to adopt, they can't have children, and they find this non-Jewish child and they adopt them. At that point, what are they supposed to do? Because they're a Jewish family, so obviously they're assuming the child should be Jewish. So what they do is the court converts the child, assuming, like making an assumption that the child is going to choose to be a Jew when they're old enough to make a choice. And if when they're old enough to make a choice, the child decides he's a Jew, he was always a Jew the whole time. And if when he's old enough to make the choice, he says, no, I don't want to be a Jew. Okay, you don't have to be a Jew. And then he was never a Jew. So it's a conditional conversion. Now, what does this mean when he's old enough to make a choice? So there's 2 situations that could happen. Normatively, as the sages would view it, this child should always know he was adopted, should always know that he was converted. Meaning the concept nowadays of people not telling people they were adopted, and that whole philosophy was never part of the sages' view on it. There always was the view was, we chose you. There's nothing else like, we adopted you, we chose you, and we made you ours, and all the nice things you explain, the concept of adoption. So therefore, the assumption is that the child knows he was adopted, knows he was converted. And when is he old enough to make a choice? On the day for a girl that she's 12, and the day for a boy that he's 13. Because for a Jewish girl when she's 12, or boy when he's 13, that's when they're accepting upon themselves the yoke of God's commandments. So if this child, who knows he was adopted, who knows he was converted, and now he turns 12, it says bar mitzvah, or she turns 12, or he turns 13. At that moment, that day comes and goes, and they, are accepting and going through all the rituals of the bar bat mitzvah. Great, that means they accepted it. Can they a week later say, oh my gosh, I just remembered I had an opportunity to reject this whole Judaism business, and I'm a teenager, so I think I want to reject the whole thing? No. You only have the opportunity to reject it on the day of your bar or bat mitzvah. You can reject it that day, or you can accept it that day. If you choose to reject it that day, you were never Jewish in the first place. And if you accept it that day, you were always Jewish and could never reject it again any more than any other Jew could. Let's take a different scenario. Let's say there's a child who never knew he was adopted, who never knew he was converted. And then one day he finds out. He's 25 and he finds out. Can he reject it then? So the answer is he has until sundown of that day to reject it. Whenever day, whatever, if it's a winter that comes sundown is 4:30, or if it's a summer and it's 7:30, whatever time, whatever day, he has until sundown of that day to reject it. And if he rejects it that day, he was never Jewish in the first place. And if he accepts it that day and tomorrow he wakes up and decides he wants to reject it, it's too late. It would be just like any other Jew rejecting it. I actually had this situation where I was connected to the situation, a sort of interesting case of a couple that the mother converted after 2 of her children were born. So this was a Jewish man, a non-Jewish woman, that the Jewish man started becoming religious, the Jewish woman was interested in becoming religious, and the Jewish woman, this non-Jewish woman eventually converted. They already had 2 children. So those first 2 children were converted as children. So they weren't adopted. So they're raised in their parents' Orthodox home, never knowing that the first 2, the oldest, were actually born not Jewish and converted as children, as babies. You know, when the mother converted, they also converted the 2 children. And when they found out, it was a tremendous shock for them. Tremendous shock. And this was exactly the situation of this law that they would have had the day they found out to say, do I really want to be Jewish or not? But once that day passes, then they're Jewish like any other Jew. And if they would decide, I don't really want this, it would be like any Jew deciding, God, I'm not really interested in you. And God says, well, I'm always interested in you. But for that first day, however many hours it is until the sun sets, that is their option, which is, I guess, plugged into the system, because were they really supposed to be Jewish all along or not? Well, now we find out. But again, of course, in general terms, the assumption is that a Noahide is serving God as a Noahide, and that's what God wants from them, and God's not looking for them to convert at all. And God has tremendous, tremendous, tremendous pleasure for their choosing to serve him, as we said, without any coercions, as a Chasidei Umas Olam, as this righteous Gentile who is from his own free will saying, I want a deeper relationship with God. Okay. Something else that Maimonides mentions here, which you might not know in terms of the, it's not, we don't think of it as traditionally under the 7 laws. I know we've touched on it in our classes, is that besides what we understand officially as 7 laws, a Noahide cannot crossbreed, which would be taking 2 animals and causing a crossbreeding of the animals, or taking 2 plants and crossbreeding, grafting of plants. Just, of course, that's forbidden for a Jew, and it's also forbidden for a Noahide. And it would be under this concept of like trying to trying to blend the strands of purity as God made it in his world. God made horses and he made donkeys. He didn't ask you to decide to make something called a mule, right? So you're trying to take a species that God made and another species that God made and say, you know, I think I can improve upon the situation. I'm going to make my own new species. God says, don't do me any favors. There's horses, there's donkeys. I didn't ask you to create mules. It's interesting, of course, a mule is sterile. You know, you only get a mule by crossbreeding a horse and a donkey. A mule doesn't produce a mule. And because God's saying, that's not my world. That's not how I want my world. And the same thing with plants. God's saying, I created this plant, I created this plant. I'm not asking you to improve on my creation and crossbreed and blend the strands and make them, in a sense, impure because of your own like devices, your own God playing things here. God says, this is how I decided to do it. This is the best. And please don't mess up my world and create new things that I'm not asking for. Now it's interesting here. So we spoke before about circumcision. And we said that Abraham was obligated with circumcision. So, of course, as you might know, the Arabs also circumcised because Abraham had a son, Ishmael, who was the father of some of the Arabs. Not all Arabs are descended from Ishmael, but there are many that are. And Ishmael was circumcised. And they say, we're following, you know, Abraham and Ishmael, and we also circumcised. They circumcised at 13 years, as Ishmael was circumcised at 13 years. But Maimonides clearly writes here that that's not the law, and circumcision was, as he proves from verses I'm not going to go into, was given for the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the Jewish people. And for no one else is a concept of circumcision something that's God's asking. If God's not asking of you, like, why are you doing it? Now, there are some that say after, so if you go back to the lineage of Abraham, Abraham had Ishmael. When Ishmael was 13, Abraham, Ishmael, and all the people of Abraham's household were circumcised. A year later, Yitzhak is born. Isaac is born. He's circumcised at age 8 days. Sorry, not age 8, 8 days old. First person to be circumcised at 8 days old, which is actually very interesting. One of the great easy things to tell someone in terms of the proofs of the Bible is that the commandment for circumcision is 8 days old. And what they found is the clotting factor in the human body is not at 100% when you're born. It grows over the first week of birth. It gets stronger and stronger and stronger every day. And when you get to 8 days old, it's at the highest point of your entire life. I don't remember what percent it's at, but it's like 100 and I remember 110%, 120%, 125%, 130%. Don't ask me. I could look it up. But 100+% at 8 days old. And then after that, it goes down, down, down until it gets to 100%. So very, very interesting that the day of circumcision is the day chosen by God when the clotting factor in the human body is at its highest point that will ever be his entire life. And exactly when he's 8 days old. Now, after Isaac, when Isaac is 37, there is the binding of Isaac, which is actually today's Torah portion. And through the binding of Isaac, there actually was a death. Not Isaac's, but his mother, Sarah. Says that, I mean, there's different ways explained. Some say that the forces of evil came to her and were giving her a blow-by-blow description of what happened. And at that pivotal moment when Isaac was actually taken off the altar, the shock was so great that she passed away from it. That's sort of the midrashic explanation. The Kabbalistic explanation is that she understood that there was supposed to be a passing here, and she chose to pass away. It shouldn't be her son. Instead, of course, it was her. So that was her passing. But either way, however you want to understand it, exactly as Isaac is not sacrificed on the altar, exactly at that moment, his mother, miles away, Sarah, dies. Which is why we see in the Torah portion, right after the binding of Isaac, the next thing we see is the death of Sarah. Because she passed away literally as he was on the altar and taken down. After that, after the mourning period, Isaac, I mean, not right away, but later Isaac got, it says he got for his wife, his father Abraham, another wife, which actually was the same original wife. Now she's called Keturah. That was the same original Hagar, who is the mother of Ishmael. And Abraham had many children with her. Some say that those children of Keturah also are obligated in circumcision as they were born to Abraham after he was commanded by God to circumcise, meaning Ishmael was born before, so he's really not viewed any more than any of the other servants of the household that were circumcised. But some say the children of Keturah actually are obligated. And nowadays, of course, we have no clue who these people are. They're somewhat mixed among the Arabs, the sons of Ishmael, meaning Ishmael is the father of gigantic, if you want to call it, family of the Arabs. And these sons of Keturah, these other sons of Hagar, also are the forefathers of many of the Arabs. So the sons of Ishmael are not required to be circumcised. The sons of Keturah are required to be circumcised, which means nowadays we have no clue who, and there's not one Arab alive that knows if he's descended from Ishmael or Keturah or somebody else. So therefore, the sages say in general, any Arab could choose to be circumcised. He doesn't have to, but definitely it would be appropriate for him to be circumcised. But to be circumcised as Abraham was, because the whole point is that it traces back to Abraham, which is 8 days old, meaning there are many Arabs that circumcise, but they circumcise at 13 years following Ishmael. And the sages are saying it's nothing to do with Ishmael, but if you want to go back to Abraham, then it's 8 days old. And that is appropriate for any Arab, because maybe you're a descendant of the sons of Keturah. But if you don't do it, you're not punished, because, you know, we're saying it's sort of optional, because we don't really know. Nobody can prove it. You don't really know if you are or not obligated in this. Okay, so we're in the middle of this. We're sort of towards the end. So maybe it was a little bit scattered, some of the ideas, but what we're doing is really going through Maimonides' laws on the Noachides. We skipped much, because a lot of it has a lot to do with details on if you did this, and if you didn't do this, and you are obligated to die here, or to be killed, you are obligated to be killed with this, and I didn't think most of it was relevant. But I did think there were definitely points that were relevant, and that gave us points of thought in terms of our relationship with God, points of thought in terms of, like we were saying about the stealing. I thought that was an incredible point, how careful we have to be even on something less than the value of the smallest coin. Points of thought on our obligation to make sure the world around us is a moral place, like speaking about having to set up those courts of justice, and why the people of Shechem were all killed out, because they did not prosecute Hamor for abducting and violating Dinah, and other such things there. So it's wonderful seeing the faces I saw. Thank you, Danielle and Sherry. Corinne, I hope you feel better. And Dixie and Crystal, thanks for joining. And does anyone have any thoughts or questions on anything that we discussed tonight?
No, but thank you so much.
Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Where do
Thank
you live,
you.
Crystal? Remind me.
I'm in Huntsville, Alabama.
Alabama. Okay, so an hour later by you.
I'm Central Time as well.
Oh, Alabama Central Time as well. Oh, okay, fine.
Yeah.
Only 9 o'clock. It's not so
Yes,
bad.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Wow, Alabama. Do you have any Noahides around you?
No, we don't. Not that I know of. We're military though, and we just have gotten here. So I'm familiar. I've heard of Danielle from like Karen and the people that were in Texas and the Waco area, and in Dallas, and then yeah. So that's how I think because they have a women's Torah group, but they normally do that Wednesday or Thursday.
Danielle, you're famous.
She's linking people together.
Isn't that
I'm
beautiful?
trying.
I have to
God.
say, honestly, when I never thought that much about Noachides before getting close to James and Danielle. And when I did, which we realized was quite a number of years ago, we dated it by my son's bar mitzvah, so it's about 13 years ago, and we knew James way before that. What was struck to me was honestly the loneliness of being a Noahide. I felt that very, very emotionally. I felt that I'm an emotional person, as most women are. And I was like, I'm so lonely. Like, I'm somewhat alone, except I have a whole network of children and a network of family and a network of friends and a network of community. And I still can feel myself somewhat alone. And just thinking of the loneliness of the Noahide. And to me, that was like such a point of sacrifice for God, to accept that loneliness and serve God as a Noahide. So I think it's beautiful that Danielle is helping lessen that loneliness and helping bring people together and feel that sense of community. You could be in Texas and Colorado and Chicago and Evanston. And you know what? You don't have to be alone. That's
Thank
really
you.
cool. Thank you, Danielle. And I'm sure there are other groups that are doing it as well. And it's very meaningful because, you know, like sometimes we think like, oh wow, it's really hard to serve God properly. And I don't think God wants it to have to be so hard. I mean, like sometimes he does, you know, some things are difficult, but it shouldn't have to be everything so hard. There shouldn't have to be always these points of pain. And definitely there's some things that Danielle can't take care of, but this is wonderful. And that's really nice to hear. And that's why I think it's so nice seeing on Zoom that you could see people's faces, because that gives a greater sense of the community,
Yep.
you know, of the connections.
Yeah, absolutely. I know I will eventually figure Zoom out completely, but I'm really, you know, I'm really bad about like I have a hard time sitting down to listen. And so I'm like, you know.
This one you can walk around.
Yes, yes.
On the bottom of your screen, it says on the well, if you're looking at your screen, it's on your facing your left hand. There's options there, mute and stop video. So if you X stop video, then nobody sees your face, and then you could wash your dishes, especially if you're muted at the same time, or you know, put your kids to bed, or whatever else you're doing with your life, clean up, shop. But if you're not doing any of that, you're just sitting in front of the screen, then you could you know, hit that little thing, and then you get to share your face.
Absolutely. You know, Zoom was a little more difficult to set up. I don't know what I was thinking, but it took me a few more minutes than what I thought, because, you know, you had to remember Apple passwords to download it. And
oh, wow.
So it was just funny. It's like, I'm so like not tech savvy.
I think we all feel that, right?
Yeah.
We're considered tech savvy. Well, Danielle's tech savvy, but and I also say I'm not tech savvy. But guess what? What you got to do, you learn, and then you don't know anything else. You can still tell yourself you're not tech savvy.
Yeah.
Anyway, have a wonderful week.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Danielle, for doing this for everyone.
Thank you. You're the one teaching us.
And a sense of
Thank you, everyone,
being
for
part
joining
of
us.
something. And it's really very beautiful. Have a wonderful week.
Amen.
Thank you.
You
too. Amen. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Won't take. I couldn't, which is okay.